Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Hunter Ohanian of the Stonewall National Museum and Archives here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And yes, it's true. You just heard me talk about Robin Bird's cable TV show in Fort Lauderdale, in New York, back in the old days. And I want to welcome all of you here. And I want you to say hello to our guest this evening, Allen Ellenzweig. Hello, Allen. How are you?
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, we're very happy to have you. Where are we finding you this evening?
I'm in New York City, New York.
Yeah, and in the Chelsea neighborhood?
In Chelsea, yes, in my apartment.
And what street are you on? You don't have to give the actual address, but just get a sense of the neighborhood.
I'm on West 15th Street.
West 15th, okay.
Yes.
And so how have you done with surviving the pandemic and COVID and all that stuff?
I just followed all the rules.
Really?
And here I am, yeah.
And you are happily on your partner slash husband slash boyfriend's computer, and so thank you so much to him. I don't know that you and I don't know that I've ever met your partner. What's his name?
My partner's name is James, and he's sitting right beside me.
Yeah, and so that's nice to have him. Hello, James. We're happy to have you here as well.
Hi, I'm a husband. I've worked hard for that title, so I'm a husband.
Well, that's true. That's why I had to put all the titles out there, because it's so funny. I mean, I've been with my partner for 30 years, but we now are legally married for like 12 plus years. But it's anyway. We could have a whole other show about all that stuff. But I want to say hello to my colleague Paula Sierra. Paula, you're back there, and so hello, Paula. Thank you. Hi, thank you. So Paula's here actually to help us get through this. And so this talk is going to go from right now at 6:30 until 7:30 East Coast time. And today, I believe, is March 2, 2022, just to put a timestamp on here. And so just to let a few of you know that if you don't know about Stonewall, we're probably one of the second or third largest LGBTQ archives in the United States. In our archives, we have 2,700 linear feet of LGBTQ history, mostly from 1950 to the present day. And when I first came here, I had no idea what 2,700 linear feet of archival material meant, but it actually means going all the way up one side of the Empire State Building, page by page by page, and then all the way down the other. And as we like to say at work, that's a hell of a lot of gay shit. And so it's a tremendous amount of stuff, and it really is. Most of it goes back to 1950 to the present day, and it's from all over the United States. Of course, being here in Florida, we are very Florida-centric in the collection that we have. And but if any of you are here in South Florida and you would like to do research here, of course, books like Allen's book could not happen without tremendous research, without the resource of archives and libraries and museums out there to make it happen. But if you are interested, please visit our website at stonewall-museum.org. And there's a place for you to reach any of us, and we will respond to you. We have researchers in probably 2 or 3 times a week right now, which is just great. There are different projects that they're working on, and we do our best to get them the materials that they want and also make sure that they have a good time. In addition to the archive, we have a library. And the library now has 28,000 volumes in it. It is believed to be one of the largest LGBTQ libraries in the world. It's all organized under the Library of Congress system. So the books are all arranged and searchable, fiction, nonfiction, biography, and the entire card catalog is available through our website as well, too. We very much rely upon donations from individuals. And so if you have gay books out there that you would like to donate to us, please, again, the best way is reach us through the website, but send them to us. We have about 1,000 titles in our rare book collection, which are not circulating, but we really have probably the largest LGBTQ library out there. And it's so powerful to be in that space to see all of these books about gay history, about fiction, about nonfiction, about biography, which we're going to be speaking about tonight. And many of these books, of course, are available in other metropolitan libraries, but to see them all together in one place, particularly when we're at a time right now here in Florida. Alan, I don't know what's going on in New York right now, but if you pay any attention to what's happening in Florida, we actually have a state legislature and a governor who actually want to prohibit using the word gay in classrooms or discussing gender identity. What do you think about that?
I think it's horrific. I think it's just really, it's actually rather frightening.
Right. It's shocking, of course, that in this day and age that we get propped up again as being the boogeymen or the boogie women, and that kids get used as pawns in this whole thing. And it's no different than Anita Bryant with her Save Our Children campaign about how awful homosexuals were. And, you know, here we are again, and we actually face the possibility. I mean, we won't know until the end of March, but we actually face the possibility that this incredibly divisive legislation might come into place in a major state, the 8th largest state in the union, that will prohibit classroom teachers from using the word gay or discussing someone's sexual orientation or even how they identify from a gender standpoint. It just takes my breath away. But anyway, so that's why we maintain this library. It's why we do these talks and put all this stuff out there. If you have friends who are not able to see the talk right now, they can certainly see it after this. They're all posted on YouTube and on our website as well too. So please encourage them to see it. I want to do a shout out to our friends on Facebook. Thank you for joining us. And for those of you who are here live, please feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat or the Q&A. We'll be monitoring those as we go along. Two last things I want to mention. We have 2 exhibitions up right now. One is called Misinformation, which is comparing all the misinformation that came out in the early days of the HIV and AIDS epidemic to what actually started during the COVID epidemic. And it's amazing how all the lies and all those things are the same. That will be coming down very soon, and that will be followed by an exhibition called Early Gay Gatherings, looking at what individuals in the Daughters of Belitis and the Mattachine Society were doing and how they were trying to share information. But please come by to see Misinformation. And then we just opened an exhibition last week by an artist who passed away in 2002 by the name of Robert Giard. And Robert Giard made a number of amazing, well, he made 800 amazing black and white portraits of artists, of gay writers and artists and activists in the mid-1980s until his death in 2002. And we have 10 of them on view right now, and they're just a knockout. We did a great talk with them again, with an audience yesterday about those, and they're really very beautiful. So please come by and see those as well too. We will have a curatorial walkthrough about that show if you'd like to see it, and you can go again to the website to be able to see all that. And last thing I have to say is thank you to our friends at Our Fund. Our Fund is an LGBTQ community foundation located here in South Florida, and they provide funding for us to be able to do all this great stuff. And it's great. You know, this is one of the silver linings of COVID that is much of a pain in the neck as it's been. It's allowed us to bring people from all over the country, indeed the world, to talk about gay literature, gay art, gay politics, gay topics in any way that we wouldn't necessarily have the ability to do because the travel is through Zoom. And so it's been great. So I have finished what I have to do. So let's go back to Alan. So it's nice to have you here and nice to talk to you about your biography of George Platt Lynes. And just to put your book in some kind of context, I mean, it's from Oxford, but I believe the last page here is page 639.
Well, yes, but the last 100 or so pages are all filler. The index, the index and stuff like that. Also the end notes, it's really only about 500 pages of narrative reading.
Of course, and I don't mean to say that, but I say that as a testament to the creative, the amazing tone that you've created here. But let's let everybody understand a little bit about your artistic and professional background. You and I met probably 10 or 15 years ago when I was at Leslie Lohman. I think I just happened to have here your other book, the Homoerotic Photograph, and this the paperback version came out in 2012, and I think that's when you and I first met. But let's just update everybody, let people know what you've been doing in your career.
Well, certainly I've written for periodicals. I've been for a long time, I would say almost two full decades now, a contributor to the Gay and Lesbian Review, writing on art, theater, film. Occasionally I write pieces that are of longer length. I've also contributed, usually with both a Jewish and gay theme, to the periodical, the online periodical tablet. And indeed, only recently I wrote something about the sort of underground anti-Semitism of the gay cosmopolitans of the 20s and 30s, specifically ending up with a well-known, at the time, scandal involving Cecil Beaton, who very injudiciously wrote some anti-Semitic language in an illustration that he did for Vogue magazine in about 1938, I think it was, if I remember correctly. So I've written on gay and Jewish themes, more on gay themes, and for a very long time. I started out as an art critic. I had been to an art school, Cooper Union, and had spent a lot of time studying photography. So photography was really the visual medium that I most felt close to, and therefore pursued it. And that's how the Homoerotic Photograph was born. I had been in the New York art world also. I had worked in the New York art world, and took special interest in photography, and in the late 70s, early 80s, very special interest in the obvious gay photographers who were coming to the fore at the time.
And you've also taught too, right?
Yes, I've taught at two different colleges, the College of Mount St. Vincent up in Riverdale, a Catholic college, I may say, and also at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey.
Right. So, and so you've obviously spent a great deal of time thinking about gay issues, thinking about art issues, thinking about photography in general. And I went back to your earlier work and read the piece that you did about George Platt Lynes there. I wanted to think about, the comparison between your current book and what you had written before. But it's a question that I mentioned to you on email a week or two ago. How did George Platt Lynes end up on your doorstep? How was he something that you were attracted to?
Yeah, well, I mentioned this mostly in the preface to the current biography. In I believe it was 77 or 78, the Ileana Sonnabend Gallery did a kind of mini retrospective of George Platt Lynes' work. He had essentially disappeared for about 20 years. I mean, he was dead in 1955. There had been a few exhibitions following his death, but really past the early 1960s, his work was not seen. Nobody talked about him. And she had revitalized our awareness of him with her exhibition. And it was remarkable because the male nude material in it, so obviously homoerotic, just seemed as fresh as if it had been made the day before. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote about it. I'm not sure if I actually reviewed that exhibition, but I certainly remembered that exhibition. And when I started writing the Homoerotic Photograph, I pursued a recall of whatever I could about that exhibition, and then just started going into whatever literature there was. Curiously, by the early 80s, Jack Woody had started publishing large-scale photo books to reacquaint a new gay population, in particular, with George's career. And that was tremendous because it gave us a real review of who George was, both as a photographer of the nude, but also as a portrait photographer, as a fashion photographer, as a photographer of mythological subjects. So that really, he reemerged, and that piqued my curiosity a lot. And as it happened, I became acquainted with someone who knew the Lynes family, had lived with the Lynes family, and introduced me to the nephew of George Platt Lynes, George Platt Lynes II. And I was very lucky that they really took to me as I took to them.
Yeah, no, and it's great, and it's wonderful to think about people like at your point in your career, where I view it as being a wonderful mashup between a family that wants to get the artistic heritage and importance of this member of their family out there, but then also somebody who has the ability to do the research and to be able to do the writing, and for them to be able to trust you and be able to make that happen. There's so many artists, of course, and unfortunately many of them deceased, but there's so many artists that they've not gotten their day in the sun, as it were, or the critical, and I mean that in a positive way, but the critical analysis and the historical context, which is important for that to happen. And so it's rare and it's wonderful that you were able to create that relationship with the family. I also have to mention too that another person here in South Florida, David Lettick, of course, has done a lot of work on George Platt Lynes, and he has a wonderful book out there as well. So let's give people a little bit of context. I have a few notes, but of course you're the expert, and we're going to get to a presentation about him in a moment. But so interestingly, he died when he was 48 in the mid 1950s.
Yes.
And so he died a few years after Eisenhower was sworn in as president, and the McCarthy hearings had probably started by the time. He probably witnessed those to some degree. But 48 certainly was a young age for somebody to die. He grew up in a wealthy, privileged family.
I would caution you about that.
Okay.
His family was genteel,
Okay.
but they were not really wealthy. They were at best middle class, upper middle class. His father was a rector, an Episcopal minister at several Episcopal churches in the Northeast between New Jersey, and then George grew up largely in Great Barrington. His father could not have afforded to send him to the prep school he went to, except for the fact that the headmaster of the school where he did go, Berkshire School, was a golfing buddy of his, and took care of either took care of the tuition or gave them a severe reduction. So they lived nicely, but really it's not as though they had lots of money. They were around. They always had parishes that were better heeled than they were.
Yeah.
So they were around wealthy people.
But that's a really good point, because in the sense that they might have been firmly middle class as opposed to having a lot of access or a lot of privilege, but yet because of the occupation the family was in, because they were involved in clergy, there was something that was bestowed upon them, so that he was able to go to private schools, and he was able to mix with other people of wealth because he went to those private schools.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I mean, I find it interesting that even in school, Lincoln Kirstein was a classmate of his. And give people just a sense about Lincoln Kirstein.
Yeah, well, Lincoln's father was involved at a high level with Filene's department store in Boston, and the Kirstein family was really quite well off. And although his father was an observant Jew, Lincoln, I get the sense, was able to enter the Brahmin society without much trouble, and I think it happened also because of the friends he had been able to make in Boston society for reasons not entirely clear to me. It's been a while since I read Marty Duberman's wonderful biography of Lincoln. Lincoln was just somehow able to pass, if you will, as a kind of honorary Brahmin, despite being a Jew. And he was one of the few Jews, in fact, at the Berkshire School. I don't know that they had an official quota, but in any case, there were very few Jews there. So he was exceptional in that regard.
In your travels, did you ever go to the Filene's department store in Boston?
Once that I can remember. There was a Filene's here in New York briefly. I can't remember how long it was here.
But of course, that was a Filene's basement. But I still so I grew up in New England, and I went to school in Boston College. So when Filene's was truly a department store on Washington Street, but it's very interesting. But going back, obviously sticking with Lynes. So when he died, shortly before he died, tell us this part about the fact that he ended up living with his brother, and he had a bit of a tussle with the IRS, and he had to pay what, $5,000 in back taxes or fees, and
it wound up being even worse than that. That's probably the official figure that he owed in back taxes, but I suspect that interest had accrued, and in fact, they took all of his equipment from him. They took all of his means of livelihood from him, and he had to auction it off in order to pay the debt to the IRS. Fortunately, his brother Russell was very wily, and through a intermediary, the intermediary bought everything at auction and gave it to Russell, who in fact had paid for it. And Russell then lent it back to George so that he could continue his career. And George, by the way, insisted that Russell lend it to him, not simply give it to him. And so George's money was the bane of George's life. He didn't do well when he had it, and he certainly didn't do well when he didn't have it. The last years of his life were, I wouldn't say he was absolutely impoverished, but he was not in good financial shape at all.
And again, there, I mean, I read these biographies, and reading about Peter Hujar, having nothing at the end of his life, or Paul Tech working at a grocery store, but they didn't aspire for any kind of glamour. Certainly, I think you point this out in the book, that George, as an adult, let's say for those 25, 30 years that he lived as an adult, or 25 years, he had glamour around him. It's what he wanted. He almost epitomized that sense of I mean, this is somebody who was having tea with Gertrude Stein, and I mean, the range of people he was exposed to, and not that he was a fraud, he was a real player in that community as well too. It wasn't as if it wasn't anything sincere, but he wanted the good things of life.
Yeah, and we'll see some of the other players that he knew in the PowerPoint, because lots of the people he knew, he of course photographed.
Yes. And of course, that's such a wonderful way. And so as I think about this, I think about two things. One, there is the work that he created. And then also there's the experience of a gay man in the first half of the 20th century in the United States and Europe. And those are two really interesting stories that you have here in the book. So let's, if we can cue up the PowerPoint, why don't we go through some of that?
Yeah.
Because I know you have a better timeline here than I'm throwing at you. So.
All right, so I'm going to do that. And I will share this. Okay. So I want to start just with these two images of George himself. We see the young George and the more mature George. I think it's evident that he was a quite good-looking young man. This is probably in Englewood, New Jersey in about 1927, when he would have been 20 here. And then the later photograph is probably when he's in his mid-40s, I would guess shortly after the war. Probably
yes, and as you say, he's very handsome, but also important for people to know, again, based upon what I saw in your book, that even at an early age, his parents were somewhat concerned about him because he might be a bit more effeminate or might not be as much of a man. And
absolutely.
I remember something that you wrote, or I read that you wrote about he might brush up a little too close to other men in classes, and so he had...
It was called, he was too kittenish. That's what the headmaster said. He said this to George's parents. He has a tendency toward being kittenish with the other boys.
Oh my God. Well, so, okay. So that's going to be the next thing here in Florida. You can't say the word kitten in Florida in classrooms anymore. Okay.
This is Berkshire School where he went. As you see, Kirstein third from the left there. They weren't in the same year. But and I don't think they overlapped all that much, but they were aware of each other. And Kirstein was particularly aware of George because he found George to be, as you suggest, somewhat effeminate. And I think Lincoln perhaps projected his own fears onto that situation because he certainly didn't want to be thought of as being an effeminate guy. And of course, one of the other interesting issues about their relation to one another, distant though it may have been, was that they each probably suspected the other of being more successful getting the athletic boys to their bedrooms. Yes, George definitely managed to get some of the boys to his bedroom. And, years later, he would say they may have hated themselves in the morning, but they always came back for more. And I say the trio begins here only to indicate that Monroe Wheeler up top on the right and Glenway Wescott were already in a relationship with one another since about 1919. When they were going to New York in late 1926, early 1927, the journalist Bernardine Zold, who we see pictured here, who was a friend of Gertrude Stein's, knew both of these gentlemen and recommended that they meet up with George. When George had been in Paris, he managed to be introduced to the Stein salon and had made a reputation for himself. She was very fond of George and called him Baby George. So they did meet up with George, and wouldn't you know, George managed to glom on to Monty, or also Monroe, because he just was insistent that Monroe was meant for him. And Glenway had to not step aside completely, but he certainly was placed in the second tier. And so, here we have an image of them when George began traveling, usually in the spring or summer, to France to stay with them in the south of France at La Cabane, their little home above the hillside, on the hillside town of Villefranche-sur-Mer, which was a harbor town.
And of course, they were traveling to Europe, but any indication in your research that they visited the Vizcaya estate in John Deering and that wealthy population of young gay men at the same time?
No, I have not seen any mention of that. They did go to the casino in Monte Carlo. That I know for sure. So they traveled, and here they are traveling somewhere in Europe in 1930. It might have been Austria or Germany. I know that they particularly went there. And here we have Monroe with an heiress, a very well-educated, very cultivated young woman named Barbara Harrison. And they became partners in a business called Harrison of Paris. They were publishing deluxe illustrated editions. They were successful for about 5 or 6 years. But by the early 30s, as the political climate in Europe was becoming more iffy, they knew that they were going to have to leave, return to America. And when they did so, the younger brother of Glenway, Lloyd Wescott, who we see here in the lower right-hand corner, met Barbara. They fell in love, and Barbara married Glenway's younger brother, Lloyd. In 28-29, when George was first in the south of France, he met up with Jean Cocteau through Monroe and Glenway, because the Hotel Welcome was where Cocteau had a little sort of circle buzzing around him. Many artists and writers made their home at the Hotel Welcome, and it was kind of it was sort of an artist colony without intending to be. And so everyone knew everyone. Everyone walked into everyone's rooms. It was a real there was a real camaraderie. And George, who was not yet an official photographer, in fact, he was trying to be a writer, because after all, he was with Monroe Wheeler, a publisher, and Glenway Wescott, a literary figure, part of the lost generation, and certainly part of the expatriate American and British group living in France. And so he thought, you know, he had to be a writer, but that wasn't really to be. When both Monroe and Glenway saw his early photographs, such as these two portraits, they almost immediately said, this might be where your real talent lies.
And of course, this is at a time in which Bernice Abbott was making portraits of her circle there, and also Man Ray was influencing many photographers at the same period of time. And of course, we don't know for a fact, but that's certainly Man Ray would have been an exhibition of Man Rays in the late 20s would have been something they would have gone to on a Friday night or a Saturday night in order to be able to see that work.
Yeah, and we're going to see a little bit of the influence of Man Ray. And Berenice Abbott, of course, was photographing largely, though not exclusively, the lesbian figures who were so important to modern literature at the time, whether it was, you know, Sylvia Beach or René Crevel, who was a surrealist poet, part of the Stein salon. And here we have, of course, this wonderful portrait of Stein that George did some years later in 1931 when he visited her at her country home. And, you know, she's here overseeing the valley, the Rhone Valley, and looking for all the world like a great empress overlooking her territory. This photograph became rather well known at the time, but very well known in 1934 when it was used in part for Time magazine at the moment when Gertrude and Alice were touring America because she had just published the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. And despite the fact that George would insist he was not a surrealist, in fact, he rather disliked any idea that he should be called a surrealist, he did work in a surrealist vein from time to time. And The Sleepwalker is a perfect example of that. This was actually, you know, two negatives brought together of this sleeping man atop a kind of platform supported by the lower half of a man's torso. And I say in the book that the sleeper is a dream of an image where one can easily imagine the coiled man snoozing peacefully, envisioning in sleep, as the observer does, the picture's bottom half, the sensual lower regions of the male anatomy from behind, there where the cleave of the buttocks suggests a passageway to pleasure. And I would claim that, although George would never have wanted to simply express himself openly as gay, it wouldn't have worked in, as a public figure. It might not have worked. Certainly within his own circles, everyone knew he was gay. And I would submit that this photograph is a kind of declaration of his homosexuality.
Well, yes, can we stop there?
Sure.
Because I think that's a wonderful, wonderful point. In the sense that, we talk so much today in our 21st century eyes, and having seen so much about gay art and seeing what's going on. But it's hard for me to look at the Sleepwalker and not think that that would be perceived as a non-heterosexual image, that there is a desire, there's a same-sex desire in that image. There is a gay gaze in that image, which you simply cannot ignore. One may not be able to always articulate the reasons why, but when you look at that image, it's really hard not to say, and I would even say the Untitled with the Crossed Arms is as well too, far more subtle, but I think that they're both perfect examples side by side. And again, as you say, it was surrealism here. It does, as you say, it tells us about a gay look at that time. Who else was doing this work in 1935?
It's interesting also, I think, that surrealism gave artists license to explore sexuality across the board, and in a way that was perhaps ambiguous enough. It was a kind of exposure of the id, and that had the license that surrealism gave it. And certainly, Fantastic Art Dada and Surrealism, the 1936 exhibition in which the Sleepwalker appeared, I think Alfred Barr, who was, to my knowledge, not gay, but certainly responded to this image because of its potentially exploring the id, as surrealism was permitted to do. I would, by the way, mention that George didn't want to be thought of as a surrealist. He must have also been aware that the formal surrealists, including in particular André Breton, were decidedly anti-gay. They were absolutely anti-homosexual. Breton made that quite clear. And George would not have wanted to be part of any school, but particularly a school that was noticeably anti-homosexual.
And so here we're looking at this one in 1935, and so 35 minus 7. So he was actually in his early 20s when he made this work.
Well, in 1935, he would have been 28.
Okay, he was 28 when he made
28.
And he was an individual, even though he may not have used the word homosexual, but he was probably at that point an individual who believed he had, at least in private, the right and the desire to be with other men.
Yes, and most of the people he knew in the art world, and when I say the art world, I don't only mean the visual art world. I mean literature, I mean performing art, opera, ballet. He was, from 1935 on, he was invited by Lincoln Kirstein to document Balanchine's choreography. So he had lots of familiarity through the ballet with gay men, gay dancers. So, he lived in a world where being a sexual marginal of whatever stripe, bisexual, somewhat gender transgressive, was perfectly known, obvious, accepted. Let me just, there we go, how to find my cursor. And again, I would say here, you know, it's surreal to the extent that there's a narrative suggestion, but we will not be able to figure out what this image actually means. There is no, you can't tell me you know what is actually happening here. It is either dreamlike or nightmarish. It happened to have three people that he knew in it: Edward Bigelow, a dancer, Dora Maxwell, who was his business manager, lab assistant, and Jonathan Titchener, who was himself the latest lab assistant that George had, and who became his lover. He was, in fact, the younger brother of George Titchener, who had been George's previous lover, although lover is not quite the right word. George Lynes was in love with George Titchener. There's no indication that George Titchener was in love with George Lynes, but in any case, George Titchener died in the Second World War, which was a terrible blow to George Platt Lynes. And he took on his younger brother in the lab and in his bed. This is a wonderful figure, Jimmy Daniels, who was part of sort of cafe society, both in Paris and New York. He would eventually open up his own place in Harlem. This was, of course, during the Harlem Renaissance. This portrait of Jimmy Daniels with the hands coming in there's hand silhouettes and hand gestures seem to be an odd kind of surrealist trope that George uses frequently, and that, by the way, I think Cocteau used as well. I think here you really get this wonderful sense of really ebullient entertainer. Jimmy Daniels just must have been quite a wonderful character, and I wish somebody would do a biography of him, because he did live well into his 70s at least. As I say, Kirstein invited George to document the early Balanchine ballet companies, which were not yet the New York City Ballet. And of course, here we have Orpheus and Eurydice, a famous Greek myth, and starring Lou Christensen, who we see here as Orpheus, Daphne Vane as Eurydice, and William Dollar as the Angel of Death. Lincoln wanted the ballet school and the ballet companies to try to incorporate more indigenous American subject matter. And so something like Jones Beach, which was co-choreographed by Jerome Robbins and Balanchine, would have been more sort of everyday American fare, whereas Bourrée Fantasque would have been a much more typically French slanted subject matter. And Balanchine returned to the Orpheus myth in the late 40s, 1948. It was a huge success. And because of that success, it was performed, by the way, at City Center. Morton Baum, who was one of the heads of City Center, invited Kirstein to create a company that would use the New York City Center as its home base. And that is how the New York City Ballet was born in 48. And George photographed the pas de deux of Nicolas Magallanes and Francisco Monsión in his studio and took the liberty of completely undressing them, so that the ballet became not only a ballet choreographic study, but a series of nude studies with, by the way, these prop incorporated into the choreography. And these props were created by Isamu Noguchi. And here we have, you know, the portrait had really been his earliest calling card. We have to remember the nudes were by and large not exhibited. Yes, the Sleepwalker was exhibited, but most of his nude photography was rarely exhibited and almost never published. it was the portraits that became his calling card, and that he was able to get out into the world, particularly because, you know, he was involved in photographing really well-known writers, many of them Europeans, like Gide, Colette, Catherine Ann Porter was becoming a well-known short story writer. This is years before she became famous with Ship of Fools. Of course, the Algonquin Round Table's great wit, Dorothy Parker, and then not a writer, but an important figure in American culture, the British curator and film expert Iris Barry, who was invited to create the film department of the Museum of Modern Art. Thankfully, by that time, both Lincoln Kirsten and Monroe Wheeler were figures of some real importance at the Museum of Modern Art, and may well have jointly invited Iris Barry.
And we also have to remember too, of course, this was a period in which, although the Museum of Modern Art had done photography shows, photography was still not accepted as a art form, as a valid art form among the artistic elite at the time. It was believed to be too craft-based. It was simply, if you had a machine that could make an image, it could not be as good as making a painting, which it was, of course, a 19th century philosophy. And that didn't change until the 1970s or the 1980s, in which museums began taking photography very seriously.
Yeah, there was no real serious art market, photography market in the art world. Although, you know, Stieglitz and Julian Levy had been very interested in showing photography alongside painting and sculpture. But there was otherwise very, very little exposure for photography. I would just want to point out here that we have, you know, three major figures in British and American literature here. I think Christopher Isherwood can solidly be included as both American and British. And curiously enough, you know, each of them is somewhat a sexual marginal. Yes, Thomas Mann was married. Yes, Thomas Mann had children, but Thomas Mann was keenly allied to male beauty in his, and it was evident in the work he wrote. E.M. Forster's marvelous, though posthumously published Maurice, also known as Morris in Britain, was a major figure and known by the literary world as being homosexual, and certainly Christopher Isherwood. And Isherwood and Foster were great friends. Isherwood was a figure of some marginal importance to Thomas Mann, although actually in the long run quite important, because it was through Thomas Mann that, through Christopher Isherwood, that Thomas Mann's daughter Erica was able to leave Europe, flee the Nazis, and marry who else but W.H. Auden, because Christopher Isherwood had recommended Auden to Erica as a potential mate, only on paper. They did marry, they did meet in person, they never divorced, but they never consummated their marriage. So good for you, Christopher. And here we have, you know, yes, is it a nude study or is it a portrait? And I would say it's a bit of both, but almost clearly a portrait. And I say that because the regard that the model has to the photographer, to the camera, and to the world beyond is just, you know, it's just so direct and so it's so direct and unyielding. Oops. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I have to get back to. And now, have I lost my? Sometimes this happens when you just can't find. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. So here again, we have portraits of two major literary figures, Marianne Moore, one major literary figure, one major visual artist, Marsden Hartley, who both Glenway had known in the 20s. George had photographed Marsden Hartley in the 20s. By 1943, Marsden was not very well. He had just had a successful exhibition at the Pierre Rosenberg Gallery, and George invited Marsden Hartley, who was bereft of a studio in New York, to share his studio at 640 Madison Avenue. He did that for a number of months, and within the year, Marsden was dead. Marianne Moore had also been a very close friend of Glenway and Monroe when they were living in Greenwich Village in the early 20s, before they went over to Europe. And then I include the Great Barrington Boy here as a beautiful portrait of a young man. I would note the similarity of these large shadows thrust upon the rear wall in both the Hartley portrait and in the Great Barrington Boy portrait. This is something of a formal trope that George Platt Lynes used over and over again, where the subject is in the foreground and the hot light casts an oversized shadow of the main figure against the far rear wall. The Great Barrington Boy might, in my judgment, be George's own homage to his own youth, because here he was in 52, he was well into his 40s now. And the Great Barrington Boy, this young man named Harris, I believe, does in some sense appear very much like a young version of George Platt Lynes as he appeared in Great Barrington in the teens and early 20s.
Yes, well, just going back to that last slide for a second.
Sure.
I mean, my first question is, did he ever write about the impact or the rationale for that imposing shadow there?
Not that I've seen ever.
Yeah.
It was something he used over and over again, especially in portraiture.
Yeah.
And later in his career, and I think if we were to go back, if I may very briefly, you'll see that by the time he gets to California, he lives in California for 2 years. And although he does use light and shadow very elegantly here, it's of a very different key.
Sure.
It's much more grayed. The palette is much grayer overall. And even outdoors here, there's really bright light, but it's a bright natural light. It's not as dramatic as the shadows that you see if we return to that, well, even here, you know, a studio, artificial light in the studio is much more higher key here.
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And it's almost as if it's an additional figure in the image. And with the Marsden Hartley one, I was reading something. Who was that in the background?
That may be Jonathan Titchener. And that figure may represent, for both George and Marsden, their own relatively recent losses. George having lost a young man, George Titchener, which argues for this either being Jonathan Titchener or just a model who represents, in 1943 after all, represents a young man in uniform lost to the Second World War. And Marsden Hartley had fallen in the late 1930s with a fisherman family in Maine. And one of their young sons, not all that young, probably in his 30s, had drowned at sea. And Marsden was really bereft, as was the family. He really had loved all of the young men of the family. And that particular one who was lost at sea was a particular favorite of Marsden's. And so yes, Marsden, I think, sorry?
Yes, and of course, by this time, you're talking about 1943. I think the first eulogy to a soldier, or elegy to a soldier, was probably what, 1917, when he was painting about those wonderful abstract pieces or cubist pieces about his lover in Germany at the time, and whether or
That's
not
right.
it's still a reflection back on those experiences, I think is
Absolutely.
really astonishing.
Yeah, I think it has all of that built into the image. And I think George would certainly have been aware of both those great losses, the early one during World War I and this later one of Marsden's that took place in the late 30s. We have these two fashion images. There are many others I might have chosen, but I kept it brief because these are two of my favorites, largely because, and I would choose this one in particular, Woman in Evening Dress, because it's so abstracted. It is, the composition is really a composition in shape and light, negative space, positive space. The dress itself, all black, is like a piece of sculpture. These marvelous angles, the wonderful lights and darks, and also the sort of peekaboo glance that the model has toward George. I think it's a very, very savvy composition. And here we have a favored model of George's, Lisa Fonsagrive, who was herself to become the wife of the great photographer Irving Penn. And she, by the way, spoke lovingly of George and very admiringly of him as a photographer. And here we have two mythological scenes, Actaeon and Boreas. This was meant to be a series of mythological photographs that would be joined with text by Glenway. It was going to be a book project that they worked on together. There was no particular recompense for it. Unfortunately, for reasons I don't know, it never came off as a book. Dr. Kinsey, of course, I include mostly because so much of George's male nude work found its home at the Kinsey Institute, because Kinsey was keenly interested in George's work, became very familiar with it in the early 50s. George met him at a dinner party that Monroe and Glenway held at their apartment. And here I just want us to see the very soft lighting and almost slightly out of focus way that George handled the male nude. I think it's interesting that in the early 30s, the male nude is not facing forward. There is no, we don't get to see any genitalia whatsoever. Similarly, in the image of Tony Sansone, Tony Sansone was a physique star of the period, and usually photographed albums of himself, or had them photographed, I should say, very oiled up, you know, showing off his muscles. George took a different tack. He domesticated Tony Sansone in an apartment. The lighting is not high key. It's really a very beautiful sort of landscape of the male back and male buttocks. Whereas in 1941, when George, when George began to do some group shots, you know, the men are front and center, full frontal nudity. This would not have ever been published in America at the time. People have to remember, there were obscenity laws against this. There were obscenity laws against even putting material like this in the mail, in the US mail.
Yes, of course, that was definitely the case in the 1940s. But so this raises two questions. So you touched on the fact that he had gone to a dinner party and met Kinsey, and then they had a relationship, or they had a friendship, and Kinsey apparently bought a number of his works. And then my understanding is that a major portion of the works that survived George's death ended up at the Kinsey Institute in Indiana. They have one of the largest collections.
Yes, that's quite right.
what was that his desire? Was that George's desire for them to go there?
Yes, he was in negotiations with Kinsey for a couple of years in the early 50s. And during those negotiations, more and more material was farmed out to the Kinsey Institute. I don't have evidence that they ever came upon a final conclusion for the contract of how much would be there. But it was absolutely clear that George wanted it there because I think he was afraid that if he didn't have one serious institution to house it, that the work would get scattered, that perhaps his family wouldn't know how to treat it. In fact, it didn't go to any member of his family. It was Bernard Perlin, a gay artist, who became the sort of keeper of the flame. Most of the material that George left was left in Bernard Perlin's hands.
Yeah, and of course, Bernard Perlin was a wonderful artist, and part of that same circle with Tukis and Cadmus and all those who recently, well, not recently, probably a decade now, passed away in Connecticut. But, the question about, the work being at the Kinsey Institute, and maybe I'm looking at this with my 2022 eyes on here and thinking about, I'm not accusing him of this, but I'm raising the question as to whether or not it was a career mistake for him to associate his work with a scientific institution, well respected at the time, and was certainly pro-gay at the time, because by the time that that Lynes passed, I think that hadn't Kinsey's major study come out at that time, talking about a large percentage?
Yeah. Now, the human Sexuality in the Human Male had been published in 1948.
Yeah.
And when he met Kinsey, he and Monroe and Glenway were all great friends of Kinsey's, and they introduced him to lots of artists and writers who were homosexual. And Kinsey interviewed lots of people in that circle. And I think George could not have anticipated where the future was going to go. But what he did know was that he wanted, being at Kinsey gave it a kind of imprimatur that I don't think he could foresee would ever be available elsewhere.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. It gave his work the most respect. MoMA wasn't going to take it all. The Whitney wasn't going to take it all. Other institutions were not going to do it. But it raises the other question. We're going to run out of time here. But, when I look at this Tony Sansone, and then also this male nude group, and thinking about him passing in 1955, it makes me think of, Al Urban and of Bob Miser, and sort of where that genre went. And also, this is a whole other conversation, how much those artists were influenced by Lynes's work, because they had to have been seeing it. And so, to me, in looking at these images, it doesn't look like he was particularly influenced by any of that physique pictorial muscle magazine of the 1950s, even though some might see the intersection of those. Yeah,
I think that's right. And I think clearly his own work would 20 years later influence a new generation of gay photographers who came out, including Robert Mapplethorpe, Dwayne Michaels, Herb Ritz, etc. I'll finish up just showing without maybe commenting, and we can just get to the very end.
I have to go back for 1 second, even though I'm always the first one here. But go back just one.
Sure.
This has always been one of my favorite pieces of queer domesticity. This is truly looking at a time in which it was simply about queer people being at home. And it's the mattress on the floor, and it's just dealing with day-to-day stuff. And yes, it may be homoerotic, and yes, it may be sexual, but to me, there's nothing sexual about this place. This is about these pieces. This is about just queer people being safe at home.
Yeah, I quite agree. There's a kind of banality
Yes.
to it. Although, of course, what is not so banal or banal is that it's a threesome or setting up to be a threesome. Okay, we don't get to see it. There's nothing in it that is directly sexual. You know, there's no hard cocks, none of that.
Yeah.
And it's also kind of, it's quite artificial. It's very staged.
Yeah.
It almost looks like you're looking at two scenes from a play. That, you know, you're in the balcony, you're looking down at them doing this.
All right, sorry. Let's keep it going.
No. Okay, I love this only because once again we have the, you know, the large shadows in the back, and here we have, you know, again this very even, you know, not highly keyed light, and it's a very beautiful, quite poetic and tender image, which, you know, if there's anything to be said about its homoeroticism in particular, I do think it's interesting that the male African American's head is located right in the cradle of the genital area. So, you know, either something has already happened or it's about to happen. I think it's quite beautiful. And I end just with an image of my book, my book cover.
Well, Alan, that's great. And so if we can drop your, if you can stop sharing, and
I will stop sharing.
We can close up here. And I have to say, again, always, like I said to you last week, these things always go by so fast. There's so much more that we could have talked about here, but it's beautiful work. I want to thank you so much for actually putting the time in to creating, and to actually have, you should be so proud of the accomplishment that you've made of being able to create this wonderful biography of a major 20th century artist who happens to be gay. And so congratulations for that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, very happy to. I want to do a shout out to our colleague, Paula Sierra. Paula, who's back there.
Yay, Paula.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Hope that you enjoyed it. And if you've not been able, if you have friends who have not been able to see this talk, let them know that it will be up on the Stonewall website, stonewall-museum.org, and it'll be up there. Give us about 48 or 72 hours, and it will be up there. We'll be sharing it on social media as well. I have to say I've broken my own rules just because there's been so much here. We're at 67 minutes, but thank you, everybody. Stay safe and follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and also get our newsletter to find out who our next talk is with. Alan, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Bye.